One thing that has made a big difference in my classes is standards-based grading. I really like how standards-based grading has helped my students focus in on what they need to learn in a really efficient way. So why I use standards-based grading is because I think my students get a lot more out of the class because I set up my assessments in a way that is aligned with the goals of my course and helps them identify what they need to work on. So in this video, what I'm going to do is share some of the things that I do in my classes related to standards-based grading. I'm going to give a couple of examples. One is sort of like a full-blown standards-based grading course, and another one is the mastery-based final, which you can use in, say, any course really, and you don't have to change the rest of your assessment system for that course. And I also want to mention that this is not a comprehensive video about all things standards-based grading. There are lots of other people out there who are doing standards-based grading, and what I'll do is I'll link in the description below to some resources where you can look into this further. So hopefully you'll be motivated from this video to try it and to learn more about standards-based grading. All right, so why use standards-based grading? Well, one reason is that there are clear learning objectives, so your students know exactly what topics they need to learn and practice for your class. Another reason in bullet 2 is that feedback clearly identifies what has been learned, so hey, you passed these standards, and what still needs to be done. So okay, so you didn't get these problems correct, which means you need to go and study these things. So it's very clear what the feedback means. And a third reason is the shift towards learning math and not just gathering up a bunch of points and trying to game the system. The whole way this is set up is that students are encouraged, sort of given incentives to think and learn about the math, and then that gets checked off. Okay, you showed me that you learned standard 1 and standard 2 and so on. And it's not about amassing points in some kind of like a video game or something. Another reason why you want to use standards-based grading, in my opinion, is to align assessment with the ethos of an IBL class and growth mindset. So if we tell people it's okay to make mistakes, we want you to keep trying and keep learning, we should provide an assessment system where that can happen. So I think this is really important to get across, that we want to align the assessment with our values, with growth mindset, and allowing people to make mistakes and to come back and fix it. Another reason to use standards-based grading is that students aren't just squeaking by with partial credit. So it is possible for a student to get 0 problems correct on an exam, but get, say, 6 or 7 points on all the problems and get, say, a C- on the test. And so in this case, the student really hasn't learned a whole lot and can't do anything correctly, but still somehow passing the class. So I think that's problematic as well when you're just using partial credit grading in that system. And the last reason that I'm going to mention here is that instructors can focus on useful learning outcomes, not thinking of, say, gotcha questions where you have to fit only 10% of the students can get an A and so many percent can get a B. And you're thinking about, okay, here's my A question, here's my B question. It's just sort of, and that seems kind of, I think, subjective and perhaps not fair. So what I like to think about instead is think about, okay, here are the things that you should learn from this class. Here's this list of things. And then we should base our grades and our assessments on how to get our students there and then how to measure that using our assessments. So those are some reasons why you would want to use standards-based grading. Okay, so let's take a look at an analogy. So let's say you get a B- in baseball after a batting practice. So your coach says, all right, good job. You get a B-. And that was sort of the end of it. And so that baseball player wouldn't find that B- grade very helpful by itself. Now, of course, this doesn't happen on baseball fields, that coaches don't just say, okay, you get this grade. They really talk about the things that you're doing well, like, hey, you're hitting these pitches well, like these fastballs, but you're having trouble with the breaking balls. So then they'll say, okay, we need to go and work on that. right? So in that sense, it's a standards-based grading. Or another example could be, hey, you get a B minus in music. So there you go, got a B minus. Thank you for playing that piece, B minus. And that's fine. Maybe that's good enough for you. Like you just wanted to pass the class or something, and B minus is great. But if you're trying to improve as a musician, your music teacher just telling you you got a B minus isn't helpful, right? It doesn't tell you what you're doing well and where you need to practice more and how to like put all this together. So in that same way, what they're doing in other subjects like sports or music or the arts is that they're looking at standards. Like they're looking at, here are the things that you can do and here are things that you need to continue to work on. And that's how we grow as athletes, as musicians, and I argue as mathematicians. Here's a question that I thought about that really convinced me to switch to standards-based grading. Should it matter if a student learns an idea in week 4 or week 6? And I thought about that. And if I'm at the end of the term, I don't think it should matter. And that's just me. And I feel like if a student learns it by the end of the term, that should count the same. And so what I did was, with this question, I thought, really, you have a list of things that you want students to learn in a course. And of course, as in mathematics, it's hierarchical. So there's an order and a sequence to these things. But still, there's a list. And what you do is you give students opportunities, a chance to learn these things. And if they don't learn it, you give them other chances as well. So I think this question is important because in the future, it doesn't matter in subsequent courses whether they learn the derivative rules in week 4 or week 6. If they're in Calc 2 and they have those abilities and they can use them and apply them, that's fine. So I think this is an important question to ask for yourself. Like, how much does that timing truly matter in terms of the overall goals of education? So here's the first example I'll talk about, and this is where I use standards-based grading for the entire course. So the main categories are gateway exams, homework, productive failure, presentations and contributions in class, and the final project. So the way this works is the students get a pass or no pass grade for all these categories. And if the student gets a passing grade for all categories, then that student earns a B in the class. If they want to earn a grade higher than a B, then they need to submit, in addition to a pass in all the sections, all the categories, is an exceptional final project, or you could make it an exceptional final exam if you were going to go that route. And then they can earn a lower grade than a B if they are not passing all of the categories. So there are some things missing, like the homework is not a passing grade, or they didn't do their productive failure assignment, or something like that. And then the amount that the grade goes down by will be determined by how many and the depth of the no passing score. So it's not just a 0 or 1, it's also like there is a difference between turning in, say, 7 out of the 10 assignments versus turning in 2 out of the 10 assignments. So you have to take those things into account. Let's take a look at gateway exams. So this is the part where I think it's the most of the questions come up and is the most stressful if you're thinking about switching to standards-based grading. So what is a gateway exam? Basically, it's an exam that you normally give, essentially. And except that you just have problems on there that represent the standards. So if it was a calculus class, it would be they need to know the limit rules and they need to know, say, the definition of the limit and how to calculate limits using graphs or given an equation or a table, things like that. So you just put them on a test just like you normally would. And the students, they should pass all these items. There shouldn't be like you can pass only, say, 7 out of 10. They should pass all of them. So what you do is for each problem, they either pass it or they don't pass it. So either correct or they need to work on it. And then what you do is, and this is where I think people have hang-ups with it, is that you have to offer retakes in some way. So retakes, what I normally do is for the first retake, I just schedule another hour in class, say a couple weeks out. So we have time to return the tests, time for students to work on it, and then also to retake it. And they just retake the problems that they didn't get correct. And then if you need subsequent retakes, it could be at office hours, or it could be if your class allows, it could be right after class, things like that. So yeah, there are some logistics things to deal with. But I find that after the second round, there aren't that many students left who have to retake, and then you can sort of sort that out by having them come to office hours and get that done. So yes, there are more logistics and bookkeeping issues of making sure you have a record of what they passed and they didn't pass. But on the other hand, you're saving time because you're not splitting hairs between, say, 6 out of 10 points for a problem or 7 out of 10 points. So you're really just looking holistically, okay, this student understands limits. Great, check. Move on. Go on to the next thing. Or it could be, I think this student really needs to study this more. So you return and say, okay, you got to retake this. And that then requires students to have to restudy, redo it, come to office hours, do more homework, etc. to learn that topic. So that's the gist of gateway exams, at least the way I implement them. Of course, there are other ways you can deal with gateway exams if you have technology, if you have a testing center, if you have other things like learning assistants or teaching assistants. You may have other resources, and you may make different choices. So this is just one example. Let's talk about mastery-based final exams. So this is an intermediate step to standards-based grading, at least in my mind. Some people may not consider this standards-based grading, but I think this is a step toward that direction. So who am I talking to? So if you can't do standards-based grading for some reason or another, or you're just not ready to make the jump yet, I think a good place to go is to start with a mastery-based final. So how do mastery-based finals work? So the first thing is you write the final exam in 2 parts. Part 1 has all the basic standards for the course, and students should pass this section at, say, 80 to 90% or higher. So a student who passes part 1 of the final, what they do is they get at least a C in the course, or they keep the pre-final grade. So the pre-final grade is a grade that you calculate based on the usual things, midterms, homework, class participation, presentations, whatever, the usual things that you have in your class. And then you calculate a grade before they take the final exam. And they come in with what I call a preliminary grade or a tentative grade. And then so part 1 means you keep the tentative grade, or you get at least a C in the course if you're coming in below a C. A student who doesn't pass part 1 and say does a really poor performance, like 40 or 50%, I think this is a pretty clear signal that this student needs to retake the course. You're looking at the basic things. They can't calculate simple derivatives, limits, don't have the basic concepts like the derivative is the slope of the tangent line. So those things, if they can't pass that, they really shouldn't be going on to calculus 2. It's not good for them. It's not good for the next class. Another point I want to make is practice problems and a clear list of standards need to be communicated to the students. In other words, make a packet, write the standards that are on part 1, and provide a long list of practice problems for students to practice. So this is where transparency is really important. So you're like, okay, there are no surprises. Part 1 is something that you're going to expect. We're going to practice it. You have chances to learn it. And so it's straightforward. Now, part 2, I want to mention that. So part 2 is where students can raise their grade all the way up to an A. Doesn't matter where they're starting from. These are the harder problems where students can apply their knowledge and they can really demonstrate, okay, I learned the material better than I had been showing before. And I can show this to you by solving problems that have more, techniques involved, concepts, and putting them together and explaining my answers. So part 2 is an opportunity for students to raise their grade. I want to also stress that part 2 does not count against students. So if a student does 0 problems on part 2, does not affect their other parts of the grading system. So if they come in with a B and pass part 1 and do 0 of the problems in part 2, they still keep their B. They just don't get a chance to raise their grade to an A. If they come in with a C and they get a couple problems on part 2, that might be a case for raising their grade to say a B or B minus. It depends on the problems. It depends on the specific solutions that they present and how many points they get. So this is a way to keep students in the game. You don't have to change the rest of your course. And by the way, when I say keeping students in the game, meaning like even if they didn't do great earlier in the term, they still have a chance to study, work hard, and get a better grade. One of the benefits of standards-based grading is that it can improve motivation. Students feel that they can keep learning. If they keep working, they can do better in the course. And I think that's really a powerful thing, that the hard work will pay off and get them there. And I think this is where you can go back to the analogy to sports or music, that if you keep working, keep practicing, keep working on those things that you are struggling with, you're going to get better. And I think that's an important way to have your course set up. It also helps students who, let's say, they don't do well on the first exam. Some of those students might start giving up. And then you get this self-fulfilling prophecy where, well, I didn't do well, so maybe I shouldn't try so hard. And then they don't put in enough time, and then they do bad again, and they end up failing the course. So you want to keep those students going and get them to work harder, not less hard. So that's something to consider as well, that it has an effect on students who are sort of buying in and working hard, but also students who might give up otherwise. One of the big benefits of standards-based grading is transparency and fairness. And so let me back up a bit. So as a mathematician, of course, you and I think that, these weighted averages of tests and homework and final exam, that's clear and transparent, right? It's a formula. It's clear. But to students, I think they can't take those scores and translate that to specific actions. Like, I need to spend more time on limits and derivatives with the chain rule. Like, they might get that if they kind of comb through the exams, but they might just look at the score and say, okay, I got 78%. So, all right, it's not great, but I'm passing and I might be able to get a B. But it's not as directed as, okay, you need to learn these things and keep working on these things. And so I think that transparency of what needs to be learned still is important, and what the standards are, and also transparency in another sense of, you're going to get these grades for these reasons, and it's all spelled out. It's not a mystery why they get a certain grade. One way you see the transparency and fairness is that you don't get emails after the term asking, why did I get a C or a B minus or whatever grade that the students are curious about. And I think these are fair questions, because it's not clear to them, how they did on the final, because they often don't get it back. But in the courses that I teach with standards-based grading, very seldom do I get an email asking why they got a certain grade in the course, because by the time you get to the end of the term, the students know which standards they've checked off and which ones they haven't, and where they stand in relation to their grade. So it's pretty clear, and I think that's an important signal. And you'll hear this from people who use standards-based grading, that they really don't get these emails about, after the term. So I'm not saying that these emails are things that we need to avoid, and that's the reason why we're doing it. What I am saying is that these emails, or the lack of these emails, is a signal that students know where they are at in the course. Now I'd like to change gears and add some perspective and context around standards-based grading. One point I want to make is that standards-based grading, or assessment in general, is only one big part of teaching, but it's not a magic wand or some kind of magic thing that will solve a bunch of problems. So the point I want to make is, assessment is vital, it's critical, it's super important, but it's not the whole thing. You're teaching the content, how you organize your students into groups and how you manage that, all those things also matter just as much. Teaching is a system is the point I'm getting to in this part, is that assessment, standards-based grading, is one part of your teaching system. And so after you think about standards-based grading, you want to connect that in relation to all the other things you're doing in class, outside of class, your assignments, presentations, the content that you're using, etc. So they all kind of go together and they're tied together. So after you spend some time thinking about standards-based grading or mastery-based grading, whatever you want to call it, then you need to connect that to what you specifically are doing and what your goals are. So that's just the point about don't do this kind of work in a vacuum. So that's it for the standards-based grading video. If you want to learn more about standards-based grading, just a reminder, we have some links in the description below, and you can also go to our website at inquirybasedlearning.org.